They lowered her into a pit of snakes and scorpions, until a drifter fired one shot, and hell broke loose. The sun hung low over Perdition Gulch, bleeding red across a sky choked with dust and heat. The town was little more than a scattering of weather-beaten buildings, clinging to the earth like bones on dry land, the wind howling through empty alleys and rusted barbed wire. Canyons loomed on every side, jagged teeth rising from the desert floor, their shadows long and sharp as knives. Nothing good ever came to Perdition Gulch. Folks here either buried their dead or joined them. Fear walked these streets like a man with a name, and that name was Jeb Crowley. He was the kind of killer mothers warned their young about and fathers avoided at the saloon. Leader of the Blackthorn Riders, Jeb had turned Perdition Gulch into a halfway stop for death. Under his rule, the law was what he said it was, and mercy was a forgotten thing buried under 100 shallow graves. That evening, the townsfolk gathered, not by choice but by command. Word had spread by broken whispers and frightened eyes. Someone had stolen gold meant for the riders, a shipment hidden away for a deal with men worse than themselves. And though no one truly believed it, the blame had fallen on Clara Mae Dalton. Clara stood at the edge of the street, her wrists bound before her, a dust-streaked shawl clinging to her shoulders. The fading sunlight caught strands of her hair, turning them to fire. She was no stranger to sorrow. Widowed young, she'd spent years keeping her late father's ranch alive with nothing but her own grit. She was known for a sharp tongue, a steady rifle, and the quiet kindness she offered when no one was watching. But none of that mattered now. Jeb had set his eyes on her some months back, and when she'd refused his hand, and the filthy things that came with it, a storm began to brew. Jeb Crowley had a way of making examples, and tonight Clara was his lesson to the town. The crowd parted as Jeb rode in, his black gelding foaming at the bit, the dust rising behind him like smoke. His face was all jagged lines and cold eyes, a dark coat draped over broad shoulders. A snake tattoo curled from beneath his collar, wrapping around his neck like the devil's mark. Behind him rode his men, the Blackthorn Riders, faces hidden beneath the brims of stained hats, pistols resting easy on their hips. He wasted no time. From his saddle, Jeb pointed a gloved hand at Clara. "Thief," he called, his voice carrying on the wind. "Gold meant for my men. Gone. And this here's the one responsible." A hush fell, broken only by the restless stamp of hooves. No one dared speak. The preacher made a move forward, his Bible trembling in his hands, but a rifle barrel leveled at his chest kept him still. "I didn't take your gold, Jeb," Clara said, her voice ragged but unbroken. "And you know it." Jeb smiled, a cruel thing that didn't reach his eyes. "Ain't about what you did, darling. It's about what they see, what they remember. A town forgets its place too easy. I aim to remind it." Behind the saloon, at the far edge of town, the pit waited, dug deep into the earth years ago by desperate men after rumors of silver. It had since become a nest of rattlesnakes, scorpions, and bones bleached white by the sun. Jeb had used it before, though none had lived to tell of it. The townsfolk, powerless and afraid, began to move toward the place like cattle to slaughter, their faces pale and drawn. Mothers clutched children close. Old men stared at the dirt. The weight of years under Crowley's boot pressed heavy on every back. And none noticed the drifter. He came in with the dusk, a shape moving slow and easy down the main road, the dust curling around his boots. His coat was faded, the color lost to sun and blood, a coal tied low at his hip. A wide brimmed hat shadowed his face, though the evening light caught the lines of old scars across his jaw. Faint military stripes, long worn and threadbare, marked the shoulder of his coat, a relic of some forgotten regiment. He said nothing. The townsfolk stepped aside without knowing why, their eyes slipping over him like water off stone. He was a man used to moving unseen, though his kind left marks wherever they passed. The West had always bred ghosts. At the edge of the square, he stopped. His gaze settled on Clara, on the rope in Jeb's hand, and the waiting pit beyond. A muscle twitched in his jaw. He studied the scene as a man might study a storm, measuring its shape and fury before deciding when to move. Nobody knew his name, but those who would have called him Jonas Hale. He leaned against a hitching post, one hand resting near his colt. Dust clung to the hem of his coat, the long day's ride marked by the dry lines etched across his face. The setting sun painted everything in fire and shadow. A girl was about to die for a crime she didn't commit, and Jonas Hale had seen enough men like Jeb Crowley to know exactly how this night would end. The West was full of cowards hiding behind guns and gangs, men who thought fear was law. He'd bled for such men once. Not anymore. As the crowd moved, he stayed still, watching, waiting. The last sliver of sun clung to the western ridge, bleeding its dying light over the canyon walls as Perdition Gulch gathered around the pit. Dust hung heavy in the air, catching in throats and stinging eyes, the heat of the day still radiating from the cracked earth beneath their boots. A cruel hush had fallen over the crowd, broken only by the restless stamp of horses and the occasional nervous cough. They came in a line, the Blackthorn riders first, their laughter sharp and mean in the fading light, followed by the townsfolk, pressed together by fear and forced obligation. No one dared stay behind. You either showed up, or the gang made sure someone came knocking on your door come nightfall. Parents clutched their children's hands, men kept their eyes low, and women stared hollowly ahead, their faces tight with helpless anger. At the center of it all loomed the pit. It was a scar in the earth, wide and deep, its jagged edges collapsing in places where the dry dirt crumbled under its own weight. Bones bleached white by countless suns littered its floor. Some were human, long femurs, ribs picked clean, while others belonged to cattle or wild beasts thrown in for sport. The pit seethed with movement. Coiled rattlesnakes glinted in the last light, their scales rippling as they shifted. Scorpions scuttled over the rocks, tails curved and twitching, ready to strike. Jeb Crowley rode up to the edge, dismounting with the easy arrogance of a man who had never known consequence. He held the rope in one hand, a noose tied tight around the other end. His face split into a grin as he looked toward the mob. "Now, folks," he drawled, his voice carrying over the gathering like a whip crack, "Perdition's got itself a lesson to learn tonight. One of you saw fit to steal from the Blackthorns, and whether it was this little filly or not don't rightly matter. She's the one gonna pay." They jeered, though it was thin and forced. The townspeople's voices barely rose above the wind. Only the riders laughed loud and full of venom. Clara stood at the center, her wrists bound, her bare feet dust-streaked and trembling. The skin on her face was flushed from the heat and the scrape of rope, but her eyes stayed steady, though her chest rose and fell hard against a knot in her throat. She wouldn't beg, wouldn't give them that. A voice called out from the crowd, the town preacher, old Elias Warren, his white hair catching the dusk like frost. He stepped forward, Bible in hand, his voice shaking. "Jeb, in the name of the Lord, I beg you." He got no further. F. Boone, Jeb's second, struck him hard with the butt of his rifle. The preacher crumpled to the dirt, blood darkening the dust. F. grinned, a narrow, rat-faced man with a twitch in his eye, always too eager for violence and too cowardly to face it alone. "Let this be a warning to the rest of you pious sons of bitches." F. spat. Marcy Dunn stood nearby, her arms crossed, a crooked smirk on her face. Once Clara's friend, they'd grown up together, chasing wild dogs and sneaking peaches from old Ryman's orchard. But years of fear and bitter pride had twisted Marcy into someone else entirely. She wore the gang's mark now, a crude blackthorn tattooed on the inside of her wrist, and had taken to riding with them after her brother's death. Clara met her gaze, searching for some flicker of the girl she'd known. There was none. The noose came down. Jeb worked the rope through a rusted pulley lashed to a weathered post, the rope frayed and dark-stained in places. He yanked Clara forward, forcing her to the lip of the pit. The world seemed to close in, the muttering of the mob a dull roar in her ears. She thought of her father, of the way he'd looked the morning the fever took him, skin pale and sunken, his calloused hand clutching hers. "Whatever comes, girl," he'd rasped, "don't let no man take your soul." She swallowed hard, forcing back the memory. She would not die broken. As the rope slid around her waist, the mob shifted. Some townsfolk crossed themselves, lips moving in prayer. A young boy clung to his mother's skirt, burying his face in the folds. One man, gray-haired and gaunt, turned away, only to be struck on the back of the head by one of the riders, forced to watch. Jonas Hale moved through them like a shadow. He drifted toward an old supply wagon left half abandoned near the edge of the square, its boards warped and sun-bleached. From there, he had a clear view of Jeb, of the noose, and of the pit. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt, thumb brushing the worn brass of the cartridge loop. He felt the familiar weight settle over him, the cold clarity that always came before blood. He'd seen this scene before, too many times. Men playing God with a rope and a crowd. He'd watched innocents die under the rule of killers who mistook fear for justice. Not tonight. The rope creaked as Jeb began lowering Clara down, inch by inch. The snakes writhed below, tongues flicking out to taste the air, rattles singing their dry, deadly warning. Scorpions scattered from the falling dust, retreating into the crevices of bone and rock. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, the smell of earth and sweat thick in her nostrils. The pit closed in around her, shadows swallowing the last of the light. Jonas exhaled slow, his fingers brushing the trigger. He thought of a girl he'd once failed to save, a long time ago, in a town whose name he no longer spoke. Thought of the men who'd laughed then, just like Jeb Crowley laughed now. There were some wrongs a man carried in his gut like rusted iron, and each time the same kind of bastard tried to make himself a god. Jonas Hale felt a piece of that weight burn hotter. And when that fire lit, there was only one thing he knew how to do. Wait for the shot, then tear hell open. Jeb Crowley stood at the edge of the pit, his grin slick with satisfaction, the noose roped tight in his hand. The gang jeered around him, their voices sharp and cruel, rising over the dry hush of evening. F. Boone spat a glob of tobacco into the dirt, his beady eyes shining as he leaned on his rifle. Marcy Dunn's smirk faltered only for a heartbeat before she forced it back, as though daring herself to look away from the horror she was part of. Below, Clara hung halfway down the pit, her hands clawing at the rough hemp around her waist, the walls of the earth narrowing around her. The snakes writhed at the bottom, rattles buzzing like dry leaves, the scorpions shifting in the dust. She could feel their eyes, feel death waiting. Jeb, always one for spectacle, drew his pistol, turning to the gathered mob. "Ain't nothing says justice like a little thunder to send her on her way," he hollered, raising the revolver skyward, the setting sun gleaming along its barrel. The gang roared, already smelling blood in the air. Jonas Hale's thumb slid over the hammer of his Colt. The moment stretched, every sound sharp and distant. The ragged breaths of the townsfolk, the scrape of boots in dirt, the nervous shuffle of horses. Clara's face turned upward, dust-streaked, her eyes locking with Jonas's from across the space. And something in her gaze, some fierce, unbroken thread of will, snapped the last restraint in Jonas Hale's soul. He squeezed the trigger. One clean, sharp report split the air. The bullet punched through Jeb Crowley's skull, a neat hole opening dead between his eyes. For a fraction of a second, Jeb's grin remained, his pistol still raised, as though he hadn't yet heard the shot that killed him. Then his body crumpled like a felled tree, hitting the dirt in a cloud of dust. The world broke open. Chaos erupted as the shot echoed off the canyon walls. The crowd screamed, women pulling children to the ground. Horses reared, snorting and whinnying in blind panic. The gang's jeering turned to shouts of confusion and alarm. Jonas didn't hesitate. His second Colt was already in hand, the movement fluid, practiced. He shot F. Boone through the throat before the man's fingers even touched his rifle trigger. F. staggered, his eyes wide and panicked as he gurgled, dropping to his knees. Two more quick shots, one slammed into a rider's chest, spinning him into the dust. The next caught another square in the heart, dropping him without a sound. Gunpowder smoke billowed in the evening light, hanging like a ghost over the square. Jonas moved like a man born to the storm, weaving through the chaos, never wasting a step. His face was stone, his eyes cold, every pull of the trigger deliberate and final. Years of blood and hard miles carved into muscle and instinct. Around him, men scattered. Some riders scrambled for cover, firing blindly into the thickening smoke. Others turned their horses and bolted, galloping hard for the canyons beyond the town. A few townsfolk dove for doorways and behind barrels, while others, long-buried defiance rising in their chests, reached for discarded weapons. Marcy Dunn's face went ashen. The rope in her hands went slack, her grip failing, the line jerking as Clara let out a startled cry. The noose slipped several inches before halting against the pulley. Clara clung to it, her arms burning, feeling the sudden drop punch the air from her lungs. Jonas saw it. Without hesitation, he sprinted to the pit, holstering one Colt and grabbing the rope. Another shot cracked past him, clipping splinters from the wagon behind. He didn't flinch. The rope burned against his palm as he steadied it, anchoring himself at the edge. Through the haze of gun smoke and the fading sun, Clara's eyes met his again. There was fear there, yes, but also something else, sharp and stubborn. "Can you hold on?" Jonas barked, his voice hard as boot leather. "I ain't letting go," she rasped. He hauled her upward, hand over hand, even as bullets bit into the dirt around them. The rope strained, dust swirling around them, but Jonas moved with grim, relentless purpose. A rider broke from cover, raising his pistol. Before he could fire, a voice roared from the crowd. Old Sheriff Sam Whitaker, his ancient scattergun raised. "Get away from them, you sons of bitches!" The blast thundered, catching the outlaw full in the chest and hurling him back. The tide turned in that moment. Men who had cowered a heartbeat before rose up. A rancher, red-faced and shaking, swung a rusted axe handle at a rider trying to flee. The storekeeper's boy fired a hunting rifle, the shot sending another outlaw tumbling from his saddle. Jonas reached Clara's side at the edge of the pit, pulling her the final few feet. She collapsed beside him, gasping, her face streaked with sweat and dust. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Clara managed a breathless grin. "Didn't figure I'd meet you today, stranger." Jonas's lip twitched, something like a grin threatening his stony features. "I was passing through." And then the shooting dragged them back. Another rider charged from behind a wagon, gun raised. Jonas spun. Firing once, the shot tore through the man's shoulder, sending him staggering. Clara snatched up a dropped revolver, her hand steady despite the tremor in her arm, and put a second shot through his chest. The town square was a battleground now. Gunpowder hung thick in the air, the cries of the wounded rising over the clatter of hooves and gunfire. Horses screamed as they bolted, dragging empty saddles. The last of the Blackthorn riders saw the fight turning and broke for the canyon trail, kicking up clouds of dust as they fled. Jonas rose to his feet, reloading with quick, practiced motions. Clara scrambled up beside him, blood and dust smudging her face, but her eyes fierce. "Looks like we ain't done yet," she said. He gave her a look, something measured, a flicker of old pain deep in his gaze. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "We're just getting started." And the legend of Perdition Gulch, born in blood and smoke, was set in motion. The smoke hadn't yet cleared when the last echoes of gunfire faded from the canyons. Perdition Gulch lay in a shattered hush, its streets littered with the dead and dying. Bodies sprawled where they'd fallen, outlaw and townsman alike, blood soaking into dust that had seen too much of it already. Horses, some riderless and others wounded, stamped nervously in the streets, their eyes rolling in the gloom. Survivors moved in dazed silence, tending to the wounded with shaking hands. The preacher, blood streaking his temple where F. Boone's rifle had struck him, murmured prayers over the fallen. An old rancher dragged a blanket over a young boy's lifeless form. Somewhere, a baby's thin wail rose against the night, sharp as glass. Amid it all, Clara May Dalton stood like a storm anchor, dust and blood streaking her face, her eyes grim. Someone tried to lead her toward the boarding house, to tend her wounds, but she shook them off. "I ain't done yet," she muttered, and snatched up a discarded Winchester from the dirt. Her hands shook only once before she firmed them around the stock. Beyond town, the last of the Blackthorn riders fled for the jagged cliffs, the trail of dust from their horses catching in the purple light of dusk. Jonas Hale followed. He moved like a man stitched from the land itself, part shadow, part blood, all resolve. The desert stretched ahead, empty and wide, painted in strokes of red and dying gold. Coyotes howled from the far ridges as night peeled the last warmth from the earth. A blood trail marked where one of the wounded outlaws had fallen from his saddle, dark spatters on pale stone. Jonas tracked them without hurry, each step measured. He knew men like these. They'd run until fear turned to rage. Then they'd dig in somewhere high and crooked, hoping the dark would hide them. But nothing escaped a man like Jonas Hale. One by one, he found them. The first was a young rider crouched behind a rock outcropping, his pistol trembling in sweat-slick hands. Jonas stepped from the shadow and fired before the boy even noticed the death coming for him. The shot cracked the night, and the coyote howls answered. The second tried to ambush him near a dry creek bed, but a misstep sent loose stones clattering. Jonas caught the motion and spun, his Colt's muzzle flaring in the dark, cutting the man down mid-charge. The third had made it to a crumbling shack tucked against the base of the cliffs. Inside, the air stank of old wood, rodent droppings, and spilled whiskey. Jonas pushed through the door and came face to face with F. Boone. F. looked wild, his face pale under the grime, sweat streaking through the dust. Blood matted the sleeve of his coat, where a stray bullet had torn a path. Jonas leveled his Colt, but held the shot. "Go ahead," F. rasped, raising his hands a fraction. "You ain't no better than us." Jonas didn't answer. He holstered his weapon, never taking his eyes off the man, and slowly unbuckled the leather loop around his second Colt. F's gaze flickered, confused. "You get one chance," Jonas said quietly. "Make it count." The outlaw's hand shot for his gun. Jonas didn't move. The hammer of F's pistol cocked back with a click, and in that frozen instant, the room felt impossibly still. Then Jonas drew and fired. The single shot caught F. Boone square in the heart. His gun clattered to the floor as he staggered, his mouth working at words that wouldn't come. He collapsed in a heap of dust and blood. Jonas holstered his Colt without a word. Outside, the desert night had fallen fully, stars bleeding through a curtain of dark indigo sky. The wind carried the faint sounds of town, the creak of wagon wheels, the muted voices of the living cleaning up after the dead. By the time Jonas rode back into Perdition Gulch, the townsfolk had gathered by the pit. Lanterns cast flickering circles of light on weary faces, the weight of the night etched deep into them. Marcy Dunn stood at the edge, her face streaked with dirt, mascara trails dark against pale cheeks. Her gun was gone, her hands raised. She tried to meet Clara's gaze, but it faltered. "I was scared," she stammered. They made me." "Save it." Clara cut her off, the Winchester loose in her grip, but steady enough. "You spat on your own people. You helped drag me to that hole." I didn't mean." "I don't care what you meant," Clara said. "You ain't welcome here. Not now. Not ever." For a moment, silence held. Then Marcy, defeated, turned and slipped away into the dark, the weight of exile hanging heavier than any bullet. The townsfolk turned to Clara. Men who'd cowered hours earlier now stood with heads high. A woman cradling a wounded child met Clara's gaze and gave a slow nod. It was old Sheriff Sam Whitaker who spoke first. He leaned on his scattergun, weary eyes settling on the blood-spattered drifter standing a few paces away. "You're Jonas Hale, ain't ya?" the old lawman said. Jonas's brow furrowed. "Was a time," he admitted. "I heard you were dead." "Not yet." A long pause hung between them. Whitaker scratched his jaw. "I remember when they slaughtered your family. God help me, Jonas. I should have gone after him with you." Jonas's face barely moved, but something flickered in his gaze. "Wasn't your cross to carry, Sheriff?" The old man swallowed hard. "You've been wandering all this time, haven't you? Hunting men like Crowley." Jonas nodded once. Somebody had to. And that was the whole truth of it. No badge, no law, no heaven or hell. Just a man with ghosts in his blood and a revolver in his hand, chasing the kind of evil that preyed on the weak. Clara stepped closer, her voice softer now. "You saved this town." "Don't reckon I saved anyone," Jonas said. "Folks like Crowley, they just need putting down." The townspeople gathered around Clara. In the fading firelight, faces bruised and bloodied looked to her, not as a victim, but as the one who'd stood when the rest of them couldn't. "I ain't letting this place crawl back to what it was," Clara declared. "Not while I breathe." And somehow, in the dark of that ruined night, Perdition Gulch took its first true breath in years. Jonas Hale tipped his hat, his shadow long on the bloodstained dirt. Without another word, he turned toward the open desert. By the time the sun rose over Perdition Gulch, the blood had dried, the dead had been buried, and the dust lay undisturbed once more. The town that had lived in the shadow of the Blackthorn riders for years stood quiet, but it was no longer broken. The gallows rope still hung frayed at the pit's edge, a reminder of the night the ground shook and everything changed. Clara Mae Dalton never left. She took over her family's ranch, rebuilt the fences, and brought in orphan stock from neighbors too old or too wounded to keep their land. Folks came to her not just for trade, but for counsel. The men who'd once lowered their eyes in the street tipped their hats to her now. The women who whispered prayers in dark corners spoke her name with steady voices. Perdition Gulch wasn't a perfect place after that night. The West never did deal in perfection, but it was honest, and it was free. When dawn stretched pale fingers across the sky, Jonas Hale was already gone. No one saw him leave. No farewell, no final word spoken. Only a scrap of paper left on the saloon bar counter, scrawled in a rough, weathered hand. "There'll be others. Don't let him take your soul." They found his trail headed west, out toward the canyons and beyond, where the land buckled and twisted into hard country. Some said he rode toward Arizona. Others swore he crossed the Rio Grande and disappeared into the Badlands. A few claimed to see him in other towns, a lone rider in a battered coat, a ghost with a colt, arriving when the weak cried out and leaving when the blood cooled. It didn't matter where he went. In Perdition Gulch, they remembered him not for the dozen men he gunned down, nor for the way he rode into town with dust on his coat and death in his eyes. They remembered him as the man who fired one shot, and in doing so, tore a hole through the darkness large enough for the rest of them to step through. And when the wind howled through the canyons at night, they'd speak his name low and careful, Jonas Hale. A man with blood on his hands and ghosts at his back. A man no one would ever call clean, but one they'd pray for if hell ever rode through town again. The West didn't make heroes. It made men like Jonas Hale, and sometimes that was enough.